13. Coronarythrombosis, the modern epidemic. No one today can be unaware of the tremendous concern about the large number of people dying from coronary heart disease. In America and Britain, they account for more than 1/5 of all deaths. In these and other affluent countries, at least 1 out of 3 men over the age of 45 will die of heart disease. It is not surprising that in books, magazines, radio and television programs, much has been made of this problem over the past 25 years. But I find that there is still such a lot of misunderstanding about the nature of heart disease that I had better clear the air with definitions and descriptions before going on to consider the causes. It may well be that you already have what you believe is a nice, simple picture of heart disease and how it comes about. If so, it probably goes like this. There is a fatty material in blood called cholesterol. As you grow older, the amount of cholesterol in the blood increases, especially if you have food that contains too much meat fat or butter fat. Because of the high level of cholesterol in the blood, some of it tends to become deposited on the inside walls of the arteries, including the coronary arteries. These supply blood to the thick muscle that makes up the wall of the heart, which pumps the blood round the body. The gradual narrowing of the coronary arteries by the deposited cholesterol reduces the blood supply to the heart, and you then get pain in the chest when you exercise, angina, or more correctly, angina pectoris. The cholesterol deposits also encourage blood clots to form, so that sooner or later one or other coronary artery or one of their branches becomes completely blocked. As a result, the blood supply to a larger or smaller part of the heart is cut off, and then you have your heart attack, pain, unconsciousness if the heart stops, death if it does not soon start beating again. This view of a coronary attack is oversimplified. It is sufficiently misleading for me to ask you to bear with me while I go through the story again in more detail and more in keeping with the real events. Especially, I want to differentiate between what medicine knows is happening and what research is still uncertain about. Like any other organ of the body, the heart can be affected by many different sorts of disease, so that, strictly speaking, it is as silly to speak of heart disease as it would be to speak of arm or leg disease. What people usually mean by heart disease is what is variously called coronary heart disease or coronary thrombosis, or myocardial infarction, or ischemic heart disease. Even this statement, however, is rather misleading because these conditions are not quite the same. You will understand the situation better if you try to follow the disease process as it affects the heart, insofar, that is, as science understands it. I say this because in many ways no one is as yet clear about the development of the condition or conditions. In human terms, almost everybody knows what I am discussing. One common picture is that of an individual, more usually a man than a woman, and most commonly over the age of 60, who is often apparently quite healthy until he is stricken with a severe pain in the chest. He may fall unconscious and may not recover, or the pain may gradually diminish and he is put to bed. If he does recover from his first attack, he may have subsequent attacks after a shorter or longer time, with again the chance that one of these will prove fatal. Sometimes the events are different. The picture then is of a person, again often apparently well, who dies so suddenly that he has virtually no time to complain of pain or of any other symptom. The course of events leading to the established disease or diseases is unfortunately not at all clear. Indeed, whatever I now write, however carefully, will represent the views of many of the experts in this field, or even most of them. But there will always remain some who will disagree with some or all of the events as I outline them. Let me begin by talking about the so-called deposit on the inside walls of the arteries. The deposit is called atheroma. The condition is called atheromatosis. The word atheroma is Greek for porridge and refers to the irregular patches of yellowish material found on the insides of the walls of the arteries. These patches are sometimes called plaques. No one is quite sure what starts the process. Many believe that it starts with an aggregation of blood platelets on or in the wall of an artery. The platelets are tiny, discrete bodies in very large numbers floating in the blood together with the red and white blood corpuscles. When they stick together in this way, they encourage the formation of tiny blood clots. Around these clots there is gradually built up a mass of fatty material that includes a fairly high proportion of cholesterol. In due course, these patches become fibrous, much as scars form on a cut on the skin. It is the combination of atheroma and fibrous scars that leads to this stage being known as atherosclerosis. Later still, the plaques may degenerate and become chalky and hard. Atherosclerosis can occur in arteries all over the body, although it is more likely to occur in some sites than in others. It probably starts at quite an early age, perhaps in the teens. According to some authorities, it starts even earlier. As it develops, it may begin to interfere with the flow of blood, so that exercise may give you a pain in the chest because of narrowing of the coronary vessels, angina, or pain in the legs because of narrowing of the arteries to the legs, peripheral vascular disease, also known as thromboangiitis obliterans, or Buerger's disease. In peripheral vascular disease, an increase in the extent of atherosclerosis leads to pain in the legs after you have walked for a shorter or longer distance. If the condition is not treated, there comes a time when the blood supply to the extremities is so diminished that a toe may begin to die of gangrene, or the whole foot, or even part of the lower leg. Treatment may consist of drugs that widen the arteries or of operative procedures to improve the circulation by stripping the arteries of their atheromatous material. In the heart, the coronary arteries may become increasingly blocked, resulting in more and more severe angina brought on by less and less effort. A more complete blocking may also occur with or without previous angina. It could be that the blockage is due to a blood clot. This occurs more readily in an artery with atheromatous patches, partly because of the slow rate of flow of the blood, and partly because the normally smooth interior of the artery now contains rough atheromatous material. But a block may also occur because the narrow coronary artery just goes into a spasm or contraction long enough to cut off the blood supply and cause a heart attack. The outcome depends on several things. One is the size of the portion of the heart that was supplied by the artery before it becomes blocked. A second factor is the particular portion that loses its blood supply, because some portions are very much more important in keeping the heart beating than others. Thirdly, the outcome depends on whether the relevant section of the heart has blood vessels coming to it from a different direction, which can rapidly expand and bring enough blood to it by this alternative route. If the affected section of the heart is small or relatively unimportant, the heart will stop for only a short time, or not at all. If a portion of the heart has permanently lost its blood supply, that portion may die. This is called myocardial infarction, and can be seen years later in the heart where the dead tissue has become replaced with scar tissue. It seems that something quite different occurs in sudden death. It is probably also associated with severe atherosclerosis of the coronary arteries, but what appears to happen in this instance is that the heart stops beating normally and goes into a sort of very rapid shivering, known as ventricular fibrillation. This renders ineffective the heart's job of forcibly and regularly pumping blood round the body, and death ensues very rapidly indeed. It is important to remember that it is possible to have quite extensive atherosclerosis without any symptoms at all. If so, it will be impossible to diagnose the condition unless some of the atheroma has proceeded to the extent of becoming chalky, so that it shows in an X-ray film. Most, if not all adults in the well-off countries live with at least a fair degree of atheroma, but if they have no symptoms, it is usually impossible to tell whether they do have atherosclerosis, and if so, how much or where. I hope you do not think that this has nothing to do with the subject of this book. One of my main reasons for taking up research in this field was that I became more and more uneasy about the prevalent simplistic view of how people get coronary disease. The idea that it is just a matter of cholesterol levels in the blood. This idea is now so firmly held by so very many people that they end up believing that anything that increases cholesterol in the blood is likely to cause coronary disease, that anything that reduces cholesterol helps to prevent the disease or even cure it, and that anything that does not invariably increase the cholesterol in the blood must have nothing whatever to do with the cause of heart disease. I know I am biased, but this picture, in my view a rather naive one, has hindered a proper understanding of the disease and its causes, and so a proper understanding of its prevention. In fact, people with coronary disease are afflicted with very much more extensive disturbances than just a rise in the level of cholesterol in the blood. For one thing, there is a rise in other fatty components in the blood, especially the triglycerides, sometimes called neutral fats. Many people believe this rise occurs more frequently than does the rise in cholesterol. There is also a fall in the HDL cholesterol. Secondly, other biochemical changes take place, including disturbance of the metabolism of glucose or blood sugar in the same direction as that found in diabetes. There is often a rise in the level of insulin and other hormones in the blood, and sometimes a rise in uric acid. There are alterations in the activity of several enzymes. The behavior of the blood platelets is changed. One could produce a list of at least 20 indicators that often register abnormally high or abnormally low in people that have severe atherosclerosis. And only one of these is the frequent, though not at all universal, rise in the level of cholesterol. If you seek further evidence about the possible role of sugar or any other factor in producing heart disease in man, you should bear in mind the complexity of manifestations of the disease. This is particularly important in the sort of experiments my colleagues and I have conducted with laboratory animals. I shall talk about these in more detail in the next chapter. The first proponent of the idea that fat could be a cause of coronary thrombosis, and since then its most vigorous defender, was Dr. Ansel Keys of Minneapolis. In 1953, he drew attention to the fact that there was a highly suggestive relationship between the intake of fat in 6 different countries and their death rate from coronary disease. This was certainly one of the most important contributions made to the study of heart disease. It has been responsible for an avalanche of reports by other research workers throughout the world. It has changed the diets of hundreds of thousands of people, and it has made huge sums of money for producers of foods that are incorporated into these special diets. As a result, too, a very great deal is now known about the effect of different diets upon the processes of metabolism in the body, and especially upon the processes of fat metabolism. And yet there is a sizable minority of research workers, of whom I am one, who believe that coronary disease is not largely due to fat in the diet. Let me start to argue the case by looking more closely at the epidemiological evidence of the relationship between diet and coronary disease. From the beginning, a few people were a little uneasy about Dr. Keyes's evidence. Figures for coronary mortality and fat consumption existed for many more countries than the 6 referred to by Keyes, and these other figures did not seem to fit into the beautiful, straight-line relationship, the more fat, the more coronary disease, that was evident when only the 6 selected countries were considered. Also, evidence began to accumulate that not all fats were the same. Some seemed to be good, some bad, some neutral. At first, this was strenuously denied by Dr. Keyes, but by 1956 or so, these differences were accepted by him as they were by all other workers. The bad fats were mostly animal fats, such as those in meat and dairy products, saturated fats. The good fats were mostly vegetable oils, polyunsaturated fats. The neutral fats were neither good nor bad. An example is olive oil, mostly a monosaturated fat. It seemed appropriate to look much more closely at the figures of mortality and fat consumption than had been done hitherto, and this I did in 1957. By putting down all the information available from international statistics, I found that there was a moderate but by no means excellent relationship between fat consumption and coronary mortality, which did not become closer even when one separated the fats into animal and vegetable. A better relationship turned out to exist between sugar consumption and coronary mortality in a variety of countries. The best relationship of all existed between the rise in the number of reported coronary deaths in the UK and the rise in the number of radio and television sets. Making this last point serves 2 purposes, I think. The first and more superficial is to illustrate the possible dangers of finding an association between 2 events and then saying that one event causes the other. It is unlikely, you would suppose, that your chances of becoming a coronary victim are increased just by the possession of a television. But in the second place, when you look more closely, this suggestion is not so stupid after all. The factors that have been implicated in causing coronary thrombosis include several that are associated with affluence, sedentariness, obesity, cigarette smoking, fat consumption, sugar consumption. On the one hand, therefore, the incidence of coronary thrombosis will be higher in those countries in which there is a greater affluence, as measured by any index such as cigarette or fat consumption, but also by the number of television sets or motor cars or telephones. On the other hand, many of these indices of affluence are likewise indices of sedentariness. People who have a TV are likely to be physically less active than those who do not, so it is not entirely silly to point to these relationships. See the chart Trends in Coronary Mortality and Number of Radio and Television Licenses in UK. Here I was then, in 1957, with information from international epidemiological studies suggesting that it would be at least as interesting to look at sugar consumption as to look at fat consumption. There was no suggestion at that time that the existing studies were a proof of the involvement of sugar. But as in the story of fats, we now had a clue. And soon after my 1957 report, a Japanese research worker confirmed the relationship between sugar intake and coronary heart disease in 20 countries. Apart from these general figures derived from international statistics, some studies exist of particular countries or populations. A British research worker demonstrated that the rise in coronary deaths in Britain very closely followed the rise in the consumption of sugar. In South Africa, it was shown that the black population had little coronary disease, while the white and the Indian populations had as much as the white populations in America, Western Europe, and Australasia. It seems, however, that the situation is changing in South Africa. Heart disease is beginning to occur also in the black population. These facts fit the figures for consumption of sugar, which has been high for a long time among the whites and Indians, was low among the black population until some 20 or so years ago, but is now, with increasing affluence, rising rapidly. In Israel, A.M. Cohen of Jerusalem found that recently arrived immigrants from the Yemen had very little coronary disease, though it was common among Yemenis who had immigrated 20 or so years earlier. The diet in the Yemen had been quite high in animal fat and butter, but low in sugar. When the immigrants arrived in Israel, they began to adopt the usual high-sugar diet of the country. The Maasai and the Samburu are two tribes in East Africa that live very largely on milk and meat, and thus have a very high consumption of animal fat. There is, however, very little heart disease among them. You might say that this is because they are physically very active. Another possibility is that they have a different sort of metabolism from that of other people, and recent work suggests that this is actually the case for the Maasai. It seems that they have a more efficient way of dealing with animal fat without being subjected to a rise in the level of blood cholesterol. It is not clear, however, whether this is some genetic characteristic of the Maasai or whether they have become so good at metabolizing fats because they have been coping with large quantities all their lives. But what is often left out of these discussions is that both the Maasai and the Samburu eat virtually no sugar. Asian immigrants in Britain have a significantly higher mortality from coronary disease than do the native British, some 20% higher in men and nearly 30% higher in women. Yet a recent study has shown that the total intake of fat is almost the same in both communities, while the intake of saturated fat is lower and of polyunsaturated fat higher among the Asians. Thus their ratio of polyunsaturated to saturated fat in the diet, the PS ratio, is 0.85, compared with 0.28 for the native British. The high ratio in the Asian diet fulfills the recommendation of those who advocate changes in dietary fat in order to prevent coronary disease. It is clear then that the higher coronary mortality in Asians is not to be explained by differences in their fat intake. What was not measured in this study was the consumption of sugar by the Asians, but other investigations have shown that they in fact eat more sugar than do the rest of the British population. As we shall see later, this is also relevant to the high prevalence of diabetes among Asians in Britain. Let me quote only one other special study, made in St. Helena. Coronary disease is quite common on that island. This is not because the inhabitants eat a lot of fat. They eat less than the Americans or the British. It is not because they are physically inactive. St. Helena is extremely hilly, and there is very little mechanical transport. It is not because they smoke a lot. Cigarette consumption is much lower than it is in most Western countries. There is only one reasonable cause of the high incidence of coronary disease. The average sugar consumption in St. Helena is around £100 per person a year. In summary, one can say that in most of the affluent populations I have considered, the prevalence of coronary disease is associated with the consumption of sugar. Since sugar consumption is, however, only one of a number of indices of wealth, the same sort of association exists with fat consumption, cigarette smoking, motor car ownership, and so on. At this point it would be equally justifiable to look at any one of these factors as being a possible cause of coronary disease. You can also put this rather differently by considering the relationship between any two of the factors I have mentioned. If you look at how much fat and sugar is eaten in different countries, you find that they tend to be very similar for any one country. On the whole, both are low in poor countries, moderate in moderately well-off countries, and high in wealthy countries. So anything that is related to one is likely to be related to the other. You can now say, if you wish, that fat is a cause of coronary disease, and the association between sugar and the disease is accidental because fat and sugar are related. Or you can put it the other way around and say that sugar is a cause of coronary disease, and it is the association with fat that is accidental. When I arrived at this point, it seemed to me that the next step was to look at the sugar consumption of individual people with and without coronary disease. For averages can be misleading. It is one thing to show that there is more coronary disease in countries where, on average, more sugar is eaten, and quite another to show that, in any country, a person who eats more sugar stands a greater chance of getting the disease than a person who eats less sugar. We devised what we thought would be a reasonably accurate way of getting at people's sugar intake, and measured this in 20 men with coronary disease, 25 with peripheral vascular disease, and 25 matched control patients with other ailments, for comparison purposes. We spent a lot of time devising our method and choosing our subjects. The patients with coronary thrombosis, for example, were in the hospital with their first known attack, had up to this time no hint that they had heart disease, and had not consciously changed their diet. We questioned them within the first 3 weeks after admission and asked about their normal diet before they were taken ill. We later showed that this method for measuring sugar intake was as good as the much more elaborate method normally used by nutritionists for other dietary constituents. We also showed that we were wise to have examined the diets of patients who had previously been apparently quite well. When we talked to them 1 or 2 years later, what they now called their normal sugar intake was in fact considerably lower than what they had reported on the first occasion. In our study, we found a very substantially higher sugar intake in the patients with coronary disease and with peripheral vascular disease than we found in the control subjects. The median values were 113 grams a day for the coronary patients, 128 grams for the patients with vascular disease, and 58 grams for the control patients. When we published these results, there was a fair amount of criticism of both our conclusions and our method. We felt that much of this criticism was not valid, but in one regard there was justification. We had assessed sugar intake in our subjects by asking them in person, in the hospital, about their diets. Because of this personal contact, we knew which was a patient with arterial disease and which was a control subject. It was possible that we were unconsciously biased by this knowledge, and might therefore perhaps have exaggerated the sugar intake of the arterial patients and minimized that of the control subjects. In order to overcome this objection, we simplified our dietary questionnaire so that the patient himself could fill it in. The questionnaires were handed out by the ward sisters, and only after we had calculated the diets did we inquire about the category the respondents belonged to. The results of our second study were similar to those of the first. The median sugar intake in the coronary patients was 147 grams. In the control subjects, this time there were 2 groups, it was 67 grams and 74 grams. Since that time, several other workers have examined the sugar intake of people with and without coronary disease. Some have confirmed our findings that coronary patients have been taking more sugar. Some have not. There are, I think, several reasons for the negative results. First, people who have had a coronary attack are very likely to reduce their sugar intake, consciously or unconsciously, as we in fact found. You can just imagine what a shock it is to have had a coronary and how careful people will be to make sure they reduce their chances of getting another attack by keeping their weight down. The first thing people tend to do in this situation is to cut down on sugar. Second, we made certain that our controls suffered from no sort of condition that might affect their diet. So we chose healthy workers in a factory, or other patients who were in the hospital because of, say, a broken leg, but had no systemic condition. Third, we had found differences in sugar intake between different socio-economic groups and between different age groups, so we made quite certain that our control subjects matched our arterial patients in these respects. These are the sorts of reasons, I believe, why it is very possible that a less than careful selection of people to act as controls might lead to the false conclusion that there is little or no difference between the amount of sugar they eat and the amount eaten by people who develop coronary thrombosis. It has, however, been said by my critics that, since not every investigator has found that individuals with coronary disease have been high sugar consumers, the sugar theory is entirely disproved. Most of these critics are, like Dr. Keyes, strong supporters of the fat theory. The interesting point about this is that no one has ever shown any difference in fat consumption between people with and without coronary disease. But this has in no way deterred Dr. Keyes and his followers. Here let me deal with another criticism by the same people. They say that sugar cannot be a cause of heart disease because in the USA there was a considerable increase in that disease in the half-century up to about the middle 1970s, while sugar consumption hardly changed during that time. But to make these criticisms is to misunderstand or misinterpret what you can reasonably expect from population studies. First, as I have often said, I believe that sugar is an important cause of heart disease, but certainly not the only cause. Sedentariness and smoking are only two of the other factors involved, and the incidence of both of these has changed a great deal during this century. Up till recently, both had been increasing considerably, but people seem to have become more active during the past few years, and certainly many men have stopped smoking. Second, factors such as sugar and smoking and lack of physical activity take a long time to produce their effects, so that it is not easy to relate a time when changes occur to the time when they might affect the prevalence of coronary disease. Third, it could well be that a high sugar consumption is more harmful in young people than in older people. We saw earlier that there has been a great increase in the consumption of soft drinks, ice cream, biscuits and cakes. It is very largely young people that take these foods. The middle-aged have become increasingly figure-conscious, and many have now reduced their sugar intake. So it seems likely that the constancy of the average consumption of sugar hides an increased consumption in young people and a decreased consumption in older people. Lastly, and most importantly, it seems, as we shall see, that some 25 or 30% of people are sensitive to sugar, reacting to it in ways that could make them liable to heart attacks. If this is so, about 3/4 of the population might be eating the same amount of sugar as the sensitive people are eating, or even more, but this would not make them suffer from heart attacks. As I have said several times in this book, the epidemiological evidence cannot by itself prove that sugar or any other factor is a cause of coronary disease. It can only provide clues as to possible causes. We can then look for other kinds of evidence to see whether our theories hold water. Since I have so often been accused of saying that sugar is the cause of coronary disease, let me repeat what in fact I have said or written every time I have discussed the problem. Several factors are concerned in the production of coronary disease. One is genetic, that is, heredity. Others are acquired. the genetic factor is responsible for some people being more susceptible to the environmental causes than others. Among the acquired causes are excess weight, cigarette smoking, physical inactivity, and also a high intake of sugar. It may turn out that they all ultimately have the same effect on metabolism and so produce coronary disease by the same mechanism. But this remains for further research to elucidate. In the meantime, we must expect to find some people who get a heart attack although they don't eat much sugar, and some who have not had a heart attack although they eat lots of sugar, just as there are those who don't eat much confectionery but nevertheless get many holes in their teeth, and others who eat a great deal and have few holes in their teeth.